Do you have an appeal to the kidnapper?
I pray that she'll take care of the baby and return him.
I don't know what more to say.
Would you have any reason to think why she might have taken the baby?
The only thing I can think of, she must have been desperate for a baby, that she would come and take someone else's baby away from them, where she couldn't have her own, or she lost hers or something. But even losing the child, I don't think you're that desperate to go and take another woman's baby.
What is your identity? Most of us know the answer the moment we are born. But what happens if, one day, a DNA test suddenly reveals that everything you thought you knew about yourself, from your name and birth date to your very family, is completely wrong? This isn't a movie script. It is the true story of a double disappearance spanning more than half a century. An extraordinary journey to find the answer to the question, who am I, really? Chicago in the spring of 1964 was a city of bustling energy and mid-century optimism, but for Dora and Chester Fronczak, their entire universe was wonderfully concentrated within the quiet walls of Michael Reese Hospital. On Sunday, April 26th, their lives were forever transformed with the arrival of a healthy, beautiful baby boy. They lovingly named him Paul Joseph Fronczak. For the young couple, he was a dream realized, a beacon of light that promised a lifetime of joy. Chester, a hardworking and devoted machine, proudly handed out celebratory cigars to his colleagues, beaming with the pride of a new father. Meanwhile, Dora rested in the maternity ward, spending her hours cradling her newborn, tracing the delicate features of his face, and imagining the bright future stretching out ahead of them. Paul had dark hair and an olive complexion, a perfect, miraculous blend of his parents. The hospital ward was filled with the gentle hum of attending nurses and the quiet murmurs of new mothers, a peaceful, secure setting that gave absolutely no hint of the sorrow that was about to unfold. The tranquility of that Monday afternoon, April 27th, was shattered in the most unimaginable and swift manner. Around 1:40 p.m., as Dora was softly nursing her one-day-old son, the door to her hospital room gently swung open. A middle-aged woman stepped inside, projecting an aura of calm clinical authority. She was dressed in the standard attire of a medical professional of that era, a crisp white smock, sensible white shoes, and a hairnet neatly securing her graying brown hair. Nothing about her demeanor raised any immediate alarms, though she lacked the specific white cap worn by the hospital's official nursing staff. With a composed and highly professional tone, the woman spoke to Dora, explaining that the attending pediatrician needed to examine the infant right away. Trusting the safety of the hospital environment and the unquestionable authority of the uniform, Dora gently wrapped little Paul in a soft white cotton blanket and handed him over. The woman held the baby securely to her chest, turned around, and walked out into the busy corridor, the door clicking softly shut behind her. Minutes ticked by, turning into nearly an hour of quiet waiting. The peaceful atmosphere in room 418 was finally broken when a legitimate hospital nurse walked in, ready to take Paul back to the nursery. Seeing Dora's arms empty, the nurse was instantly puzzled. When Dora calmly explained that another staff member had already taken him for a medical check, a chilling realization swept over the room. There was no scheduled examination. The woman in the white smock did not work there. The hospital staff quickly initiated a frantic, breathless search, checking every room, stairwell, and exit. A laboratory assistant later reported seeing a woman matching the description hurrying out the back doors and disappearing down 29th Street with a bundled infant in her arms. Paul was gone. The disappearance of baby Paul sent immediate shockwaves through the entire city. Within hours, the Chicago Police Department and the FBI descended upon Michael Reese Hospital, launching what would become the largest and most extensive search operation in the city's history. Law enforcement officers combed through the surrounding neighborhoods, knocking on thousands of doors, searching transit stations, and interviewing hundreds of hospital employees. Postal workers, taxi drivers, and ordinary citizens were all put on high alert. The authorities released composite sketches of the unknown woman based on witness descriptions and published the one and only existing photograph of newborn Paul. Despite the relentless around-the-clock efforts, the trail grew inexplicably cold. The woman and the baby had vanished entirely into the vastness of the city, leaving behind a profound mystery and a family shattered by the unknown. Amidst the massive law enforcement response, the immeasurable toll on Dora and Chester was immeasurable. The hospital room, once a place of celebration, had transformed into a scene of profound grief and disbelief. Surrounded by investigators and reporters, the young parents clung to each other, their hopes resting entirely on the compassion of the public and the conscience of the woman who had taken their son. During a highly emotional press conference, the media gathered to hear from the heartbroken family. The flashes of cameras illuminated their tear-stained faces as they stepped up to the microphones.
Do you have an appeal to the kidnapper?
I pray that you'll take care of the baby and return him.
I don't know what more to say.
A distraught Dora Fronczak, with Chester kneeling by her side, made a public appeal for the kidnapper to return their son.
Would you have any reason to think why she might have taken the baby?
The only thing I can think of, she must have been desperate for a baby, that she would come and take someone else's baby away from them, where she couldn't have her own, or she lost hers or something. But even losing the child, I don't think you're that desperate to go and take another woman's baby.
Those desperate, selfless words echoed across the nation, broadcasted on television sets, and printed on the front pages of newspapers from coast to coast. Dora's plea was not one of anger, but of a mother's pure concern for the well-being of her child. The city held its breath, hoping that the emotional appeal would lead to Paul's safe return. Yet, days turned into weeks with no sign of the missing boy, leaving an empty crib and a question that would linger for decades. For more than a year, the agonizing silence surrounding Paul Fronczak's disappearance haunted his parents. The massive search had dwindled, leads had dried up, and the crib in Chicago remained empty. But in the summer of 1965, nearly 800 miles away, a bizarre and unexpected event unfolded on the busy streets of Newark, New Jersey, an event that would dramatically alter the course of the Fronczak family's history. Friday, July 2nd, 1965, was a typical bustling afternoon on Broad Street, a popular commercial strip in Newark, known affectionately as Ladies' Mile. Shoppers hurried past storefronts, unaware of the quiet tragedy unfolding right in front of them. Outside McCrory's department store, someone abandoned a baby carriage. Inside the pram sat a small toddler, estimated to be around 14 months old. He was dressed neatly in a blue suit and a matching cap, but he was completely alone. Hours ticked by as pedestrians walked past, assuming the child's parents were nearby. Finally, as the afternoon faded into evening, a concerned passerby alerted the local police. The authorities arrived to find the boy sniffling with a cold and sporting a fading black eye, but otherwise generally healthy. He had no identification, and no one stepped forward to claim him. The toddler was temporarily placed in a private foster home, where he was given the nickname Scott. For months, a local Newark detective named Joseph Farrell tried tirelessly to find the boy's family, running advertisements in local newspapers. When the trail yielded absolutely nothing, the detective's mind drifted to a case that had captured national headlines the previous year: the kidnapping of baby Paul Fronczak from a Chicago hospital. Noting a resemblance between the abandoned toddler and the published photos of Dora and Chester Fronczak, Farrell contacted the authorities in Chicago. In the 1960s, the realm of forensic science was vastly different from today. The revolutionary technology of DNA testing was still decades away from being discovered. Investigators had to rely on a patchwork of basic medical tests and subjective visual comparisons. Over the preceding 15 months, law enforcement had tested the blood of approximately 10,000 infants, only to rule them all out. However, when Scott was tested, his blood profile did not exclude him from being the Fronczak's biological child. But what the FBI leaned on most heavily was a highly questionable method of physical identification. Investigators created a mold of the abandoned toddler's left ear and meticulously compared its ridges, slope, and shape to the one visible ear in the single, grainy photograph taken of Paul Fronczak when he was just 1 day old. Based on this comparison, the authorities made a definitive, life-altering judgment.
FBI concluded that the little boy in Newark had the same ear structure as the kidnapped baby from Chicago. Dora and Chester Fronczak were told the remarkable news that their missing son was alive. Little Paul was reunited with his parents. But something about the story didn't make much sense to Paul. For one thing, he looked nothing like his parents.
In early 1966, the FBI sent a letter to Dora and Chester, informing them that a boy found in New Jersey was likely their stolen son. For the grieving parents, this news felt like nothing short of a divine miracle. They immediately made the long, anxious road trip to the East Coast, their hearts pounding with a mixture of desperate hope and cautious fear. Arrangements were made for the couple to meet the toddler at the New Jersey Bureau of Children's Services. The Fronczaks waited in a quiet room, the anticipation nearly overwhelming. When the door finally opened, a caseworker walked in, holding the toddler, who was dressed in a pristine white jumper with matching shoes. For Dora, the year of heartbreak instantly dissolved. Looking at the boy, she cried out, "My God, that is my baby!" Despite the emotional recognition, there was no way to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the boy was biologically theirs. The law required a formal process. Chester and Dora had to legally adopt the child they believed was their own flesh and blood. Once the paperwork was finalized, the reunited family of three made the triumphant journey back home to Chicago. A massive crowd of journalists and well-wishers awaited them, eager to capture the fairy tale ending of a national nightmare. The child was baptized in the family's Catholic church, and the Fronczaks poured all their love into giving him the best life possible. The empty room was finally filled with laughter, and soon after, the family expanded when Dora gave birth to a second son, David. It seemed the dark chapter had finally closed. They were a complete family at last, ready to move forward. No one could have possibly predicted that the FBI's conclusion, based on an earlobe comparison, would quietly set the stage for an even more profound mystery decades down the line. Growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago, Paul Fronczak lived what appeared to be an idyllic, ordinary mid-century American childhood. Dora and Chester were devoted parents who provided a stable, deeply affectionate home. Yet, beneath the comforting surface of family dinners and Sunday church services, a quiet, inexplicable dissonance shadowed Paul's early years. It was not something he could easily articulate as a young boy, but it was a persistent, echoing whisper in his mind, a vague, unshakable intuition that he simply did not belong in the very home that loved him so fiercely. As Paul grew older, the physical disparities between him and his family became glaringly obvious. Chester, Dora, and their younger biological son, David, looked like a perfectly matched set. They shared dark hair, olive complexions, and distinctly round faces with slightly drooping, gentle eyes. Paul, on the other hand, looked like a visitor from another bloodline entirely. He had sandy, light-colored hair and a highly angular, sharp bone structure defined by a prominent, strong jawline. Looking at the family portraits hanging in the living room, Paul often felt as though he had been seamlessly pasted into someone else's family album. The chasm extended far beyond mere physical appearance. It was deeply embedded in their personalities and passions. The Fronczaks were conservative, traditional, and deeply rooted in their strict Catholic faith. David was serious, quiet, and dutiful, mirroring his parents' practical approach to life. Paul, however, was fiercely independent, rebellious, and free-spirited. He possessed an insatiable, consuming obsession with rock and roll music and a desire to explore the world on a motorcycle passions that completely baffled his quiet, unassuming parents. While David and Chester bonded over shared quiet interests, Paul found solace in his guitar and the loud, expressive world of music. He felt like the quintessential black sheep, loved immensely but profoundly misunderstood. The subtle cracks in Paul's reality finally shattered on a chilly afternoon in December 1974. 10-year-old Paul was home alone, embarking on a classic childhood mission, snooping around the house for hidden Christmas presents. Knowing his parents often stashed gifts in out-of-the-way places, he bravely ventured down into the dark, unfinished basement. He moved an old sofa out of the way, opened a small wooden door, and crawled into a dusty, cramped storage space beneath the stairs. Instead of brightly wrapped toys, Paul found something that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. Tucked away in a dark corner behind some old frame paintings sat a stack of forgotten shoeboxes and a large hat box. Curiosity getting the better of him, he pulled the lids off. Inside were not holiday decorations, but hundreds of yellowed, carefully cut newspaper clippings, old letters, and thick scrapbooks. Sitting on the cold concrete floor, the young boy began to read the bold, dramatic headlines. Baby stolen from mother's arms. Largest manhunt in Chepigo history. and kidnapped infant found. As he stared at the black and white photos of his parents, the shocking truth washed over him. The stories were about him. He had been kidnapped as a newborn and found abandoned on a street over a year later. Trembling with a mix of confusion and awe, Paul gathered a handful of the clippings and marched upstairs to confront his mother. When Dora saw what he was holding, her face instantly drained of color. Her reaction was not one of open explanation, but of fierce, defensive protection. She scolded him for snooping before delivering a short, final verdict. "Yes, those are about you," she told him, her voice trembling but firm. "You were kidnapped. We found you. We love you. And that is all there is to know." The topic was immediately closed, locked away just like the dusty boxes in the basement crawl space. If you are captivated by this extraordinary journey of hidden identities and buried family secrets, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more unbelievable, true stories and deep dive investigations right to your screen. Now, let's return to Paul's life. Dora and Chester's evasive response was born out of a desperate desire to protect the boy they cherished, hoping to shield him from the confusing trauma of his past. They wanted to maintain the peaceful illusion of their reunited family. But for Paul, the discovery only deepened his internal sense of isolation. Out of respect for his parents' visible pain, he obeyed his mother's wishes and never brought up the kidnapping again during his youth, burying the clippings and his burning questions deep inside his heart. Yet the seeds of doubt had been firmly planted. The boy in the mirror was a stranger, and the mystery of his true origins would quietly lay dormant, waiting for the inevitable moment when the truth could no longer be contained. For decades, the man known as Paul Fronczak managed to push the haunting questions of his identity to the back of his mind. He moved away from Chicago, settled in the vibrant city of Las Vegas, pursued various careers, and navigated the ups and downs of adulthood. He learned to live with the lingering feeling of being a stranger in his own life. But the past has a persistent way of demanding to be acknowledged. For Paul, that moment of reckoning arrived in 2012, catalyzed by one of the most profound milestones a person can experience. He was preparing to become a father. When his fiancée, Michelle, became pregnant with their daughter, routine medical checkups became a regular part of their lives. During one of these appointments, the obstetrician asked a standard, seemingly innocuous question: "What is your family's medical history?" For most expecting fathers, this is a simple inquiry. For Paul, it was a profound trigger that unearthed a lifetime of buried suspicions. He realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that he had absolutely no idea what genetic traits or potential health risks he was passing on to his unborn little girl. The intuition that he was not biologically related to Dora and Chester Fronczak, an intuition he had suppressed out of love and respect for the parents who raised him, now became an urgent matter of medical necessity. He felt a deep, unwavering obligation to discover the truth, not just for his own peace of mind, but for the safety and well-being of his child. The landscape of science had drastically evolved since the FBI relied on earlobe comparisons in 1966. By 2012, DNA testing had become highly accessible, affordable, and incredibly accurate. The truth of his origins was no longer an unsolvable mystery locked in the past. It was available over the counter at a local pharmacy. Shortly after his daughter's birth, Dora and Chester traveled to Las Vegas for a visit to meet their new granddaughter. Seizing the opportunity, Paul decided to gently confront the unspoken elephant in the room. He purchased standard paternity test kits and sat his elderly parents down. He explained his reasoning, emphasizing the need for an accurate medical history for the baby. Although the topic of his kidnapping had remained a strictly guarded taboo in their household for nearly 40 years, Dora and Chester, driven by their enduring love for him, agreed to participate. They carefully swabbed the insides of their cheeks, sealing their genetic codes in small plastic tubes. However, the weight of what those tubes might reveal quickly proved to be terrifying. Shortly after returning home to Chicago, Dora called Paul. Her voice was fraught with anxiety and regret. She pleaded with him to throw the kits away. "We don't want the test," she told him softly. "We don't want to know." Paul was thrust into an agonizing moral dilemma. He deeply loved the parents who had provided him with a safe, nurturing home, and he loathed the idea of causing them any pain. For a couple of weeks, the sealed DNA kit sat on his desk, silently taunting him. He debated the matter endlessly in his own mind. Yet the responsibility he felt toward his new daughter ultimately outweighed the comfort of maintaining a 50-year-old illusion. Taking a deep breath, Paul placed the envelope in the mail and sent the kits to the testing laboratory. Weeks of nerve-wracking anticipation followed. Every time the phone rang, Paul's heart skipped a beat. Finally, on a quiet afternoon, the call he had been both waiting for and dreading came through.
He said, "Is this Paul Fronczak?" And I said, "Yes." He asked me a couple of security questions. He said, "This is so-and-so with Identigene. We have your results." I said, "Okay." And
How did you feel right then when you heard those words? We have your results.
I mean, I've been waiting how long for this now?
Yeah,
Oh,
months.
God.
Yeah.
Years, right?
Yeah, months,
so I'm
years,
finally gonna get the
forever.
results. He said, "There's no remote possibility that you're the child of Chester and Dora Fronczak."
Even though he had carried this suspicion in his soul since he was 10 years old, hearing the definitive scientific confirmation was a staggering, breathless blow. It felt as though the earth had suddenly vanished beneath his feet. In the span of a few seconds, his entire reality disintegrated. The name on his driver's license, the birth date he celebrated every year, the heritage he claimed everything was an illusion built on a tragic historical mistake made by the FBI half a century prior. He was a man without a name, without a birthday, and without a biological family. As the shock began to settle, a chilling wave of secondary realizations washed over him. If he was not the baby kidnapped from Michael Reese Hospital, then the real Paul Fronczak was still out there somewhere, missing. And if he was not Paul, then who was the bruised, sick toddler left in a stroller outside a New Jersey department store in 1965? By opening the DNA tube to answer one question, he had inadvertently unlocked two of the most baffling mysteries in American history. Armed with the undeniable scientific proof that he was not the baby taken from Michael Reese Hospital, the man known as Paul Fronczak found himself standing at the edge of an immense, uncharted void. The revelation could have easily paralyzed him with despair, but instead, it ignited a profound sense of purpose. He realized that his personal crisis was, in fact, a dual mission. First, he needed to uncover the truth of his own origins, to find out who abandoned him on a New Jersey street and what his real name was. Second, and perhaps even more importantly to him, he felt a deep, overwhelming duty to find the real Paul Fronczak. Dora and Chester had given him a life filled with warmth, and he wanted to repay their unconditional love by bringing their actual stolen son home. Paul knew that solving two half-century-old mysteries was not something he could accomplish alone in his living room. The trail was 50 years cold. He needed the power of mass communication. He needed the entire country to start looking. Taking a bold leap of faith, Paul decided to take his deeply personal, painful story to the public. He initially reached out to local investigative reporters, but the sheer magnitude of the mystery quickly caught the attention of major national television networks. Soon, esteemed programs like CBS News and ABC's 2020 were knocking on his door. Paul opened up his life, sharing the dusty scrapbooks from his basement, the heart-wrenching DNA results, and his internal struggle with the world. The story of the stolen baby, which had gripped the nation in 1964, was suddenly resurrected, capturing the public's imagination all over again. To find the real Paul Fronczak, the media investigators needed a visual anchor. The only existing reference was the black and white photograph of the infant taken when he was just 1 day old. ABC News, in collaboration with former FBI agents and forensic artists from the NCMEC, embarked on a remarkable scientific and artistic endeavor, using the baby photo, alongside genetic traits and physical characteristics typical of Dora and Chester's family lineage. The forensic artists painstakingly created an age-progressed composite sketch. The image depicted what the real Paul Fronczak might look like today. As a 49-year-old man, the unveiling of this sketch was designed to be a massive media event, a strategic netcast across millions of American households. During a special investigative broadcast of ABC's 2020, veteran journalists Barbara Walters and Brian Ross sat down with Paul to discuss the unprecedented breakthrough. The cameras captured the heavy emotional toll the journey had taken on him, as well as his unwavering determination.
Full-time job, I have a family, but this is my life, and this is my only shot at solving these mysteries. So I put as much time as I can. Everyone goes to bed at night, I'm online researching. This is my first actual baby picture right here. I feel kind of like an imposter because I'm using his birth certificate. Paul is out there, and I have his birth certificate, and I want to give it to him, and then I want to find mine.
Those words resonated deeply with audiences across the country. Paul's vulnerability, his confession of feeling like a trespasser in his own life, transformed the cold case into a deeply human story. He was not just a man looking for a headline. He was a man trying to correct a profound historical error, eager to hand over the name he had borrowed for 50 years to its rightful owner. The broadcast had an immediate and electrifying impact. ABC News established a dedicated tip line, and within hours, the phones began to ring. The FBI, spurred by the renewed national attention, and the definitive DNA evidence proving their 1966 identification was a mistake, officially reopened the 1964 kidnapping case. They assigned new agents to dig through the archived, dusty files, determined to finally solve the mystery they had inadvertently complicated. Across the United States, the sketch prompted a wave of introspection. Men in their late 40s who had always felt a little out of place in their families, or who had questions about their own adoptions, stared at the television screens, wondering, could that be me? The media campaign had successfully reignited hope. Somewhere out there, the real Paul Fronczak was living a life he didn't know was false, and for the first time in 5 decades, there was a genuine, tangible chance that he might finally be found. The broadcast of the age progressed sketch acted like a powerful beacon sweeping across the nation. The ABC News tip lines were immediately inundated with calls. The media campaign had created a profound ripple effect, touching a sensitive nerve for countless individuals. Across the United States, a wave of middle-aged men began to step forward. These were men who had always harbored quiet doubts about their lineage, who did not resemble their families, or who had uncovered latent life secrets about their adoptions. For a brief, chaotic period, the search for one missing child transformed into a collective national quest for identity, with dozens wondering if they might be the stolen baby from Michael Reese Hospital. Amidst this overwhelming influx of hopeful seekers, one particular story stood out with heartbreaking urgency. For most, finding their true identity was a matter of psychological peace and answering historical questions. But for a man named Sam Miller, a resident of Dallas, Texas, uncovering his roots was a desperate race against a ticking clock. Finding the truth was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. Sam Miller had grown up in the Chicago suburbs, living a relatively normal life until a staggering revelation turned his world upside down. Just 3 weeks before he appeared on the local news, Sam learned that he was adopted. Under normal circumstances, this would be a lot to process. But Sam was also battling a severe medical crisis. He was suffering from an incurable, potentially fatal kidney disease. His doctors had made it clear that his best, and perhaps only, hope for long-term survival was an organ transplant. The highest chance of a successful transplant required finding a biological relative to act as a donor. Armed with this urgent need, Sam and his teenage son turned to the internet for help, utilizing community forums like the Reddit Bureau of Investigation to crowdsource his past. During their frantic search, they placed a baby picture of Sam next to the famous, one-day-old photograph of Paul Fronczak. The visual similarity was nothing short of haunting. The shape of the face, the eyes, the overall expression, it was enough to make anyone pause. It raised a compelling theory. Is it possible that the woman who snatched Paul from the hospital in 1964 later handed him over to an adoption agency? If you are moved by these incredible true stories of survival, family, and the search for belonging, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue uncovering these deep mysteries and bringing them to light. Now, let's return to Sam's journey. Sam's story quickly caught the attention of the media, leading to an emotional feature on CBS Chicago. While the public was entirely fascinated by the true crime aspect of the 1964 hospital disappearance, Sam's perspective was profoundly different. He was not interested in playing detective, nor was he seeking vengeance against the woman in the white nurse's uniform. His motivation was entirely rooted in his deep love for his own family. During the broadcast, the stark reality of his situation was laid bare in a deeply moving exchange.
Investigation website.
You know, even if I end up being Paul, I really see no reason to try to find out who stole me. There's no value in it. I'm simply doing what is logical in order to find a way to survive, and trying to laugh on my way down, because if you don't laugh, you cry.
Sam's candid response highlighted the tragic human element beneath the sensational headlines. He proactively reached out to the FBI, offering his DNA for testing, willing to accept whatever the results might bring as long as it pointed him toward a potential donor. Although subsequent testing would eventually prove that Sam Miller was not the missing Paul Fronczak, his brief intersection with the case left a lasting impact. Sam represented the unintended but profound consequences of the Fronczak mystery. The national spotlight on this cold case became a catalyst for a much broader conversation about closed adoptions, lost medical histories, and the extraordinary lengths a parent will go to in order to secure a future with their children. Sam's journey reminded everyone that behind every decades-old mystery are real people, fighting private battles, just trying to find their way home. While the national media frenzy eventually began to quiet down, and the flood of tips slowly dwindled, a completely different kind of investigation was just beginning. Away from the glaring lights of the television cameras and the public eye, a quiet, meticulous, and groundbreaking effort was taking place in the digital realm of science. Renowned genetic genealogist Suze Moore, alongside a dedicated team of volunteer researchers, had officially taken on the monumental task of uncovering the true identity of the man who had spent his entire life as Paul Fronczak. The process of genetic genealogy is far more complex than a simple, direct paternity test. Suze Moore and her team took his genetic profile and uploaded it to several prominent online ancestry databases. These platforms were typically used by everyday people looking to build their family trees, but in this context, they became vital investigative tools. The initial results did not reveal any immediate family members. Instead, they returned a scattered network of distant relatives, second, third, and fourth cousins who shared only tiny, fragmented percentages of his genetic code. For more than a year, the team worked in absolute, focused silence. It was a painstaking, highly complex puzzle. They had to trace the family trees of these distant cousins backward through history, finding common ancestors from generations past, and then methodically build those trees forward again toward the 1960s. They navigated through countless birth records, marriage certificates, and census data, eliminating false leads and slowly narrowing the focus. Eventually, the genetic breadcrumbs began to converge, pointing definitively away from the Midwest. The data led the researchers straight to the East Coast, specifically to the bustling coastal resort town of Atlantic City, New Jersey. From the vast network of thousands of potential relatives, the team successfully funneled the genetic lines down to one specific household, a married couple named Gilbert and Marie Rosenthal. Digging into the local archives, they found a brief, almost unnoticeable birth announcement in an October 1963 newspaper. After more than 50 years of living a borrowed life, the ultimate truth was finally waiting at the end of a telephone line. One afternoon, Suze Moore picked up the phone and dialed the number of the man she had spent the last year trying to identify. He answered, completely unaware that his reality was about to shift once again. After exchanging brief pleasantries, Suze gently steered the conversation toward the breakthrough.
She goes, what do you think of the name Jack? I said, that's a good name. It's pretty strong. She goes, that's your name. And I was just blown away. I'm like, really?
The weight of those words was staggering, completely defying comprehension. The man who had spent 5 decades believing he was Paul Joseph Fronczak, born in April 1964 in Chicago, was actually Jack Rosenthal, born 6 months earlier, in October 1963, in Atlantic City. He learned that his heritage was not what he had been raised to believe. The Catholic boy from the Midwest was actually born into a Jewish family on the East Coast. But out of all the mind-bending revelations, nothing was more breathtaking than the discovery that he was a twin. The names Jack and Jill sounded like a line straight out of a classic nursery rhyme, yet they represented his profound, undeniable reality. For his entire life, Jack had harbored a deep, inexplicable feeling of isolation, a sense that a vital piece of his soul was missing. Many people who are separated from their twins at a very early age report feeling a phantom void, a subconscious longing for a companion they cannot consciously remember. Hearing the name Jill instantly provided a profound explanation for the lingering emptiness he had always felt. The mystery of his identity had finally been solved. He was no longer an imposter holding someone else's birth certificate. He was Jack Rosenthal. However, This monumental resolution did not bring the peaceful closure he had anticipated. Instead, it immediately opened the door to an entirely new, deeply unsettling chapter. If he was Jack Rosenthal, why was he found alone, battered and sick in a stroller outside a New Jersey department store? And most urgently, what had happened to his twin sister, Jill? Discovering his true name was only the first step into a much darker and more complex labyrinth. As Jack Rosenthal, the man who had lived his entire life as Paul Fronczak, began to piece together the fragmented history of his biological family, a grim and heartbreaking picture of his early existence emerged. Atlantic City in the early 1960s was celebrated as a glamorous coastal resort, a place of vibrant boardwalks and endless summer entertainment. Yet, just a few miles away from the glittering lights, the Rosenthal household operated in a starkly contrasting reality. The family environment was deeply troubled, heavily overshadowed by severe financial crises and profound personal dead ends. His biological father, Gilbert, was a military veteran, carrying the heavy, invisible burdens of his service, struggling with deep emotional scars and trauma that made steady employment difficult. His mother, Marie, found herself completely overwhelmed by the daunting task of raising a rapidly growing family. Unable to cope with the mounting daily pressures, she leaned heavily on unhealthy coping mechanisms, neglecting her household responsibilities and plunging the family into a dire financial emergency. Eventually, they lost their home due to missed mortgage payments and were forced into a cramped public housing project. In this atmosphere of relentless stress and instability, the children were the silent victims. The Rosenthal siblings were raised in an environment characterized by a severe lack of attention, warmth, and essential care. But it was the twins, Jack and Jill, who seemed to bear the absolute heaviest burden of their parents' overwhelming struggles. The reality of their harsh living conditions was vividly corroborated by the haunting memories of a former babysitter. In the late summer of 1965, a teenage girl from the neighborhood named Susan was hired by Marie to watch the children for an evening. As Marie and Gilbert prepared for a rare night out, dressed impeccably, Marie casually instructed the young babysitter to focus only on the older daughters, explicitly telling her to completely ignore the twins upstairs. Confused and concerned by the eerie silence radiating from the second floor, Susan eventually decided to check on them. What she discovered in that dimly lit, isolated room would haunt her memory for decades. Jack and Jill were confined to a single crib that resembled a makeshift wooden enclosure. The environment was unsanitary and heartbreakingly neglected. The bed sheets were heavily soiled, and the twins were wearing unwashed pajamas. Jack was cowering in a corner, holding a bottle filled with sour, curdled milk and bearing the fading marks of physical mistreatment on his face. Jill stood quietly, watching the teenager with wide, silent eyes. Moved by profound compassion, the teenage babysitter spent the entire night bathing the toddlers, changing their bed linens, and comforting them, providing a fleeting moment of tenderness in their otherwise bleak world. When the parents returned the next morning, Marie was furious that Susan had tended to the twins, a reaction that terrified the young girl and drove her to flee the house. That evening of unexpected kindness was one of the last confirmed sightings of the twins together. Shortly after the summer of 1965, both Jack and Jill completely vanished from the Rosenthal household. When extended relatives visited and inquired about the toddlers, they were met with cold evasion. Family members were explicitly warned never to mention the twins again, creating a strict code of silence that lasted for generations. As the world now knows, Jack was eventually abandoned in a stroller outside a bustling Newark department store in July 1965, setting off the extraordinary chain of events that led to his life as Paul Fronczak. But Jill simply evaporated into thin air. There was no abandoned stroller, no police report, and no trace of the little girl. The agonizing mystery of Jill's fate became the new, driving focus of Jack's life. He refused to let his twin sister be forgotten by history. Driven by dark rumors from estranged relatives that something terrible had happened right before his abandonment, Jack launched a relentless pursuit for answers. He tracked down the old property where his paternal grandmother once lived, a place the family resided in right before the twins disappeared. Securing permission and a professional construction crew, Jack dug deep into the soil of the empty lot, hoping to find any physical evidence or remains. However, the excavation yielded nothing but animal bones. refusing to give up hope that Jill might have been abandoned separately and could still be alive somewhere, living under a borrowed name, just as he had. Jack commissioned specialized forensic artists. Using family photographs and Jack's own facial structure, they created a highly detailed age-progressed sketch of what Jill Rosenthal might look like as a mature adult. Today, that image circulates through national missing persons databases, serving as a silent plea for a reunion that is over half a century overdue. Yet, despite all the technological advancements and widespread media attention, Jill Rosenthal remains a ghost, her whereabouts forming the most haunting and unresolved chapter of this extraordinary saga. While Jack Rosenthal was desperately searching for his missing twin sister, the other half of this historical mystery was quietly unraveling in the background. The massive media attention, the reopening of the FBI case, and the rapid advancement of genetic genealogy had finally set the stage for the ultimate revelation. In 2019, the impossible happened. The real Paul Fronczak, the infant stolen from his mother's arms in a Chicago hospital in 1964, was finally found. The discovery did not come from a dramatic police raid or a sudden confession, but through the quiet, indisputable science of DNA. One of Kevin's family members had uploaded their genetic profile to a commercial genealogy website, which triggered a direct match with David Fronczak, Dora and Chester's second son. The digital connection led investigators to a small, unassuming rural town in Michigan. There, living a quiet and entirely ordinary life, was a 55-year-old man named Kevin Beatty. For over 5 decades, the most sought-after missing child in American history had been living relatively close to Chicago, completely oblivious to his own famous origins. Kevin's life story was a profound testament to the quiet ironies of fate and the undeniable power of genetics. He had been raised by a woman named Lorraine, who presented him to the world as her own son. The exact circumstances of how Lorraine came into possession of the stolen baby remained shrouded in uncertainty. Whether she was the woman in the white nurse's uniform at Michael Reese Hospital, or whether she had received the child through a secondary arrangement, has never been definitively proven. What is known is that Kevin grew up in a very closed, private environment. Despite the complex challenges of his upbringing, Kevin grew into a kind-hearted man who loved playing football and basketball in high school. He eventually married, started a family of his own, and became a devoted father to his 3 daughters. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Kevin's life was how closely it mirrored the biological family he never knew. When investigators and family members looked at photographs of Kevin, the physical resemblance was undeniable. He shared the exact same round face, gentle eyes, and dark hair as his biological brother, David. They even styled their hair the same way. But the connection went far deeper than mere physical traits. Chester Fronczak, the heartbroken father who had handed out cigars on the day Paul was born, had spent his life working as a dedicated machinist. Remarkably, without any knowledge of his biological father's profession, Kevin had chosen the exact same career path. He spent his adult life working as a machinist, his hands performing the same meticulous mechanical work as the father who had never stopped looking for him. The revelation of his true identity was a staggering shock to Kevin and his daughters. However, this monumental breakthrough arrived cloaked in a profound, devastating urgency. In 2017, 2 years before his stolen son was finally located, Chester Fronczak passed away, taking the unresolved grief of his missing firstborn to his grave. Dora, however, was still alive, eagerly waiting to finally meet the child she had held for only a single day. But fate, it seemed, was not quite finished testing the Fronczak family. Shortly after learning that he was the missing Paul Fronczak, Kevin received a devastating medical diagnosis. He was battling a severe, aggressive illness that included multiple tumors. His health began to decline rapidly, making the journey from rural Michigan to Chicago physically impossible. The highly anticipated, in-person reunion that the family had hoped for over 50 years was tragically thwarted by his failing health. Despite the physical distance and the cruel timing, a beautiful, albeit brief connection was forged. In early 2020, Dora Fronczak and Kevin Beatty finally spoke over the telephone. It was an incredibly emotional, tearful exchange. Across the receiver, a mother and her long-lost son shared stories, bridging a chasm of 55 years. Dora was finally able to hear the voice of her boy, finding a small measure of peace in knowing that he had grown into a good man, a father, and a hard-working machinist just like Chester. They held on to the fragile hope that Kevin might recover enough to share a physical embrace. Tragically, that embrace would never happen. On April 25th, 2020, just one day before his 56th birthday, Kevin Beatty succumbed to his illness. The reunion was left incomplete, a bittersweet conclusion to a half-century of searching. Dora was left with a complicated new grief, grateful that she had finally found her son and spoken to him, but forever mourning the lifetime of memories they had been denied. The saga of the Fronczak family and the Rosenthal twins is a narrative so complex and deeply intertwined that it defies the bounds of ordinary fiction. As the dust settles on over a half-century of searching, we are left to reflect on the profound legacy of love that anchors this incredible story. When Dora and Chester Fronczak brought that abandoned toddler home from New Jersey in 1966, they were acting on the belief that he was their stolen flesh and blood. But even after the truth was laid bare in 2012, the undeniable reality of their bond remained untouched. Blood and genetics did not build the warm, supportive home in Chicago. Unwavering devotion did. In a poignant twist of fate, the FBI's historical error ultimately gave Jack Rosenthal a life he otherwise would never have known. Had he remained in the desperate, heavily burdened Rosenthal household in Atlantic City, his future would have been clouded by severe neglect and extreme hardship. Instead, Dora and Chester provided him with a sanctuary. They sheltered him, educated him, and wrapped him in a blanket of security and unconditional affection that allowed him to grow into a resilient, capable man and a loving father to his own daughter. When Jack sat down to interview his elderly mother, Dora, for his published memoir, she summarized their unbreakable bond with quiet, definitive grace. The truth is, from that very moment I met you in New Jersey, I never really doubted that you were my son. I loved you, and I was always proud of you. You were the son that we raised, and that was that. Yet, even as we celebrate these profound connections and the resilience of the human spirit, we must acknowledge the shadows that still linger at the edges of this extraordinary tale. The two massive mysteries that defined this journey remain partially unresolved. To this day, the true identity of the woman who walked into Michael Reese Hospital in 1964 wearing a white nurse's uniform has never been officially confirmed by law enforcement. How Kevin Beatty ended up with Lorraine in Michigan, and whether she acted alone or received the child from someone else, remains a deeply guarded secret of the past. Furthermore, the fate of Jill Rosenthal still awaits the light of day. Jack has never stopped looking for the twin sister, who shared the darkest, earliest moments of his life. The age-progressed sketches of Jill continue to circulate across national databases, serving as a beacon of hope that somewhere, perhaps living out a quiet life under a different name just as Jack did, she is still out there. Her absence remains the final, aching void in a story characterized by miraculous discoveries. In the end, the intertwined destinies of Paul Fronczak and Jack Rosenthal teach us a profound, enduring lesson about the true nature of identity. A simple DNA test has the power to shatter long-held illusions, rewrite birth certificates, and definitively answer the question of where we come from. Genetics dictate our physical traits, our medical histories, and our ancestral roots. However, biology alone does not define who we are. It is the love we are given, the daily choices we make, and the families who choose to hold our hands through the darkest of times that ultimately forge our character. Jack Rosenthal was born into extreme hardship, but his life was defined by the enduring love of the Fronczak family, proving that while DNA writes the first page of our story, it is love that writes the rest. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible emotional journey through one of the most fascinating mysteries of our time. If you found this story as deeply moving as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming deep dives into extraordinary true stories. We are incredibly grateful for your continued support. Thank you for watching, and take care.